Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? Today we're going to attempt to answer one of the questions that I've been asked time and time again in regards to Pioneer Spirits, and that is Bant or is Mono-Blue the better version of Spirits for you to be playing? And today, we're not here to answer that question. Instead, what we're going to do is a tier list of the matchup analysis for both Bant and Mono-Blue, and the reason for that is because Mono-Blue and Bant aren't the same deck. Sure, they both play Supreme Phantom, but that's really about where the similarities end. So instead of straight up being able to tell you which version of Spirits is better because they don't try to perform the same function, what we're going to do today is let you see the matchup analyses for each of the two versions of Spirits, and that way you'll be able to make an informed decision as to which version of Spirits is better suited to you. So here we've got a few tiers that we're going to separate all of the decks into, and again, this is going to be matchup analyses for how each of these decks performs against Spirits. So for the S tier, we've got super free matchups, and this is going to be a matchup that is incredibly easy for Spirits. A is going to be a good matchup, not quite as free as the S, but still one that you're generally happy to see in a tournament. And in the middle lies the B tier. C tier is for the decks that, can we dodge? You don't really want to play against these, but you're not hanging your head like this if you do see it. You just would rather not. And D is for the decks that kind of dunk on us. So let's find out exactly where each deck lies. First up, we'll go over the matchup analyses for Bant Spirits. Alright, first up is going to be Selesnya Angels with Collected Company and Kayla's Reconstruction, and this is going to be a deck that we would rather dodge as Bant Spirits, but is not necessarily the end of the world. So they do have things like Resplendent Angel and Righteous Valkyrie, both of which are bigger than our entire battlefields most of the time, but with the addition of Kayla's Reconstruction, they're playing fewer angels and creatures and are instead trying to resolve 4 and sometimes 5, 6, or 7 costed spells so that we can actually make use of counter spells like Spell Queller for Collected Company, Mausoleum Wanderer for either of the instant and sorceries, and even copies of Lofty Denial if you have them in the main, making them a little bit weaker against us than they have been in the past. Azorius Control is going to be one of those S tier matchups for us. As Bant Spirits, you really want to see blue-white control all the time. You have Mausoleum Wanderer to help fight against their counter spells, you have Collected Company for instant speed threat generation, Selfless Spirit to help against Supreme Verdict, and in your sideboard, you can choose between cards like Shaper Sanctuary to stop them from trying to target your cool stuff, or you can even play cards like Extraction Specialist to get cards out of your sideboard, out of your graveyard post Supreme Verdict. And if all that wasn't enough, you can put even more counter spells into your sideboard. Dovin's Veto? Cool. Blue and white counts as Bant colors. Mystical Dispute? Alright, counter that to Fairy for 1. Lots and lots of options against Azorius Control. And all mirror matches go into B. Next. So Indomitable Creativity is going to be A for a very good matchup. So the Creativity deck is just trying to resolve a giant sorcery speed spell, which does typically bode well for your things like your Mausoleum Wanderers, and if you're playing them in the main, your Lofty Denials. The only downside, and the only reason that it's not S, is that your opponent's not really going to cast Creativity for 1, meaning that it's going to be a spell that has a mana value greater than 4, and your Spell Queller can't really handle that too well. But still, this is a net positive matchup. Elves is going to be one of our first D tier matchups. This is not a deck we really want to fight against. So you can win against Elves. You have Skyclave Apparition, you have Shacklegeist to tap down their mana elves, and you can generally fight back in any number of ways, especially since they can't really block you if you can get your ball rolling. The problem with this matchup though is that Elves is way faster than you are, and unless you get to do something super cool like use a Mausoleum Wanderer to counter a copy of Collected Company or something similar, it's a pretty uphill battle most of the time. And Fires of Invention, there's a few different versions of this deck, but they're all essentially trying to do the same thing. Resolve Fires of Invention, turn that into free spells, and try to control your board along the way. Since they're just trying to resolve a bunch of bigger spells, that's a matchup that Spirits generally thrives against. And Being able to spell queller their namesake card, the Fires of Invention itself, makes this a fairly good matchup. We're going to put it right into A. Greasefang is going to be another A-tier matchup for us. It's very close to an S-tier matchup, and there's a lot of tools that we have against it. We have things like Skyclave Apparition to get rid of Greasefang itself, Shacklegeist to help tap down either Greasefang or a vehicle that you're trying to crew, and if you really need help in the sideboard, you can even put things like Remorseful Cleric or Rest in Peace into your board to make this matchup go from relatively easy to easier. Great stuff all around. So Gruul Aggro is gonna be a B-tier matchup because this one really can go either way. And most of the time, it honestly depends on whether you're on the play or the draw. On the play, you can typically do something about their turn 3 or turn 2 copies of Reckless Stormseeker, which is the card that gives all of their entire deck haste. You don't really want to deal with that. On the draw, it's much harder. And a lot of times it's very coin flippy. One of the bigger upsides to this matchup, though, is that your Skyclave Apparitions are insanely good here. Like, everything other than Sky Sovereign, up to and including copies of the Akroan War, can be gotten rid of with a Skyclave Apparition, making Gruul Aggro a fairly reasonable matchup. Not great, just reasonable. And the Heroic deck is going to be another B-tier matchup, and just like Gruul, is, in my opinion, very die roll dependent. If you're on the play, you can typically fly over what they're doing, sometimes establish a Shacklegeist, and then lock their entire board down with really no hope of being able to recuperate. But if they're on the play, a lot of the times they can get under you fairly well with prowess creatures like Soulscar Mage and Monastery Swiftspear. They can Reckless Rage your Shacklegeist or a Skyclave Apparition to basically get back their resources, and it can be very tough. But this is a very swingy matchup, and in my experience, most games against Heroic are never close, one way or the other. B tier for sure. Lotus Field is going to be an A tier matchup for us. So a lot of the times they're just trying to resolve big giant spells after of course establishing their mana with Lotus Field itself and copies of Thespian Stage. The fact that they take effectively their first 2 turns of the game off most of the time means that we generally have a lot of time to establish a clock. You can play your cards like Mausoleum Wanderer, which helps to counter key spells like Pore Over the Pages. You can establish things like Selfless Spirit to counterspell their, or not counterspell, but to defeat their Path of Peril and other sweeping effects. And generally post board, you can do whatever you want really. If you want to put in counterspells like Mystical Dispute and Dovin's Veto, those are available. If you want to play white cards like Eidolon of Rhetoric, that's also available. And the Time-Honored Damping Sphere is still there. Lots of tools against Lotus Field combo that makes this a pretty good matchup for us. Mono Green Devotion is going to be another A tier matchup for us. And as Bant Spirits, you generally get to do a lot of things about what your opponent's trying to do. And that's exactly where you want to be against Mono Green, because if you don't do something about what they're doing, they're going to run you over just like everybody else. But they can't block your flyers, which is super nice outside of exactly Cavalier of Thorns, but that's a card that you can tap down using Shacklegeist. If they play Old Growth Troll or Karn or something similar, cool, Skyclave Apparition helps to take care of those things. And other than Skyclave, the entire rest of your deck flies. Again, Cavalier of Thorns can only do so much against you. But this deck also gets to play cards like Empyrean Eagle and Supreme Phantom, and when you land those off of a Collected Company, your opponent's going to have a really hard time staying not dead, even when they have their mana established. It's a pretty good matchup for us. Mono Red Aggro is going to go right into the C tier. So Mono Red is a deck that we just do not really want to see, especially if we lose the die roll. So they can get under us fairly easily, and unless we can do something like establishing a Collected Company that can maybe get a Skyclave Apparition or 2 and get their stuff off the table, it's usually really hard for a deck without actual hard removal, like Bant Spirits, to stop Mono Red from doing its thing. And its thing is faster than our thing, making it a very tough matchup for us. We can win this matchup, but we would rather not have to face it in the first place. Mono-Blue Spirits is actually an A matchup for Bant Spirits. And the primary reason for that is because all of the spirits that you're playing are generally bigger than all of the spirits Mono Blue is playing. It also doesn't hurt that you get to play Skyclave Apparition and Mono Blue doesn't. When you combine those two things, it's usually fairly hard for Mono Blue to really get established, because even a 1/1 with a Collected Company will just lose to a 2/3, like a Spell Queller or an Empyrean Eagle. It's kind of hard sometimes for Mono Blue to be able to get its attacks off, and that's exactly where Bant likes to be in this matchup. Humans is going to go right into the B tier, and this is another one that I found to be very die roll dependent. For humans, if they get onto play, they can establish lines like 1-drop, Luminarch Aspirant, Brutal Cathar, double 2-drop, and that's a curve that not many decks in the format are beating, especially not a deck without removal. And unfortunately for us, that's exactly what we are. Bant Spirits, other than Skyclave Apparition, is a deck without removal. So sometimes you will just get run over by the fact that the humans deck generally has a lot more power and toughness than you're able to really deal with. However, on the play, it's a lot better for us, as we can have time to establish things like Shacklegeist, like Skyclave Apparition is very good on the play, whereas it's kind of medium on the draw, and then of course a well-timed Collected Company can really do the trick, especially if they don't find a Thalia before that point in time. But the nature of the matchup is that it's very, very swingy, and you will fight a lot in combat, so bring a calculator. Either way, good luck. B tier matchup. And 5-color Niv is going to be yet another B tier matchup. And the reason for this is a little bit wonky. They play a mega crap ton of removal. And normally, you don't really mind that so much. But everything has value too. So you have things like Niv Mizzet Reborn to effectively draw sometimes 7 cards at a time. Like, that card's insanely good if it resolves. Oh, wait a minute. It's a 5-drop. It almost always resolves. So Bant Spirits will sometimes play 2 copies of Lofty Denial, but no other actual counterspells in the main that can deal with anything that costs 4 or greater. And unfortunately for us, that means that a Niv Mizzet Reborn, a 6/6 flyer that draws a bunch of cards in one go, is generally going to resolve against Bant. And that's just not exactly where we want to be in life. But a lot of times they'll also play cards that are pretty annoying for us to get around, like Abrupt Decay, which can't be countered, Supreme Verdict, which also can't be countered, Bring to Light, which can get anything from Supreme Verdict to Tulsa Mirror to Valky. You kind of see where this is going, right? A lot of their spells that cost more than 4 are actually kind of hard for Bant Spirits to deal with. But if they're trying to rely on the half of their deck that is casting spells that cost 4 or less, then the matchup is very good for us. But it usually depends on who sees which portion of their deck, because both decks have the tools to beat the other pretty handily. Izzet Phoenix is going to go right into our C tier here, and I think Phoenix is a deck that's fairly reasonable most of the time as far as the draws that it can see, but it plays a lot of removal. So it's got like Lightning Axes, Strangles, Fiery Impulses, even Spikefield Hazard could see some play. And all of these things will add up to us being generally unable to keep a huge board presence on the table. However, if you can navigate that removal, you can totally win the matchup, especially if you can get rid of something like an early Ledger Shredder or an early Thing in the Ice with your own Skyclave Apparitions. You can totally win it, but it's going to take some work. Rakdos Sacrifice, throw that right into the D tier. This matchup is terrible. So the reason for that's twofold. First, they do the whole claim to firstborn thing, where they take any of your creatures and all of them cost 3 or less. So it basically says take any creature from Bant Spirits. And then they can use a sacrifice outlet like Village Rites, Witch's Oven, or even Priest of the Forgotten Gods to make sure that your creature really stays, especially if you have something like a Spell Queller or a Skyclave Apparition. Maybe they shouldn't take that one. But a Spell Queller is pretty good. If they take a Spell Queller and then sacrifice it, now they got the benefits of whatever the sacrificing outlet was, and they got their spell back, and it's just not a great look overall. But that's only the first problem. The second problem is the card Mayhem Devil itself. That card by itself has the ability to beat our entire deck. The reason for that is a lot of our creatures are simply 1 toughness, right? And if you have a bunch of 1 toughness creatures and your opponent is already trying to sacrifice things like Fabled Passages, Witch's Ovens, food tokens for Cauldron Familiars, things that they've taken with Claim to Firstborn, Priest of the Forgotten Gods will sacrifice 2 creatures at once to make you sacrifice a creature, and then you sacrificing a creature also triggers the Mayhem Devil. It's a very, very uphill battle. And if you're not playing things like a boatload of counterspells to deal with it and are relying on things more like Skyclave Apparition to try to help after it's resolved, that might be too late. And for those 2 reasons, Rakdos Sacrifice is a terrible matchup for Bant. And lastly, we have Rakdos Midrange. That's deck in the format. So Rakdos, in my opinion, is actually a B tier matchup for Bant Spirits. So Bant has a lot of tools that can generate 2-for-1 advantages, and unlike a lot of other decks, it plays Skyclave Apparition in the main, meaning that you actually do have a main deck way to deal with a giant threat like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. You have things out of your sideboard too, like Shaper Sanctuary and Extraction Specialist, that can generate you 2-for-1s, and kind of try to outdo the 1-for-1 parity that Rakdos really aims to achieve. What they're trying to do is just remove all of your creatures on a 1-for-1 basis, right? So they have spells like, their Fatal Pushes, Power Word Kill, and if you're able to like navigate those, maybe you throw in a Rattle Chains piece of protection in there somewhere, right? But then you get to collect the company and get 2 cards instead of 1, or you get to Extraction Specialist and get 2 cards instead of 1. Well, now your opponent's going to have a really hard time kind of dealing with all of that value on a 1-for-1 basis. And doing that in a creature deck is generally how you overcome Rakdos. Either you do something like Mono White Aggro does, and you're just trying to overwhelm them so hard that who cares how much removal they have, or you're trying to just draw so many cards that you don't care if they try to resource you for resource 1-for-1, you're just going to draw 3 anyway. And Izzet Phoenix does a very good job at that. What Bant Spirits is doing is really the Izzet Phoenix route. You're trying to collect the company, Shaper Sanctuary, Extraction Specialist, even Reckoner Bankbuster. Any number of cards you can use to get yourself more cards than they have access to is going to be your key to victory. So this is going to be my matchup spread for Bant Spirits. Let's see how Mono-Blue Spirits performs. Alright, so now let's talk about Mono-Blue Spirits matchup analysis. And I think one of the first things that we'll notice is that Mono-Blue has a much more polarizing matchup spread than Bant does. And a lot of that's going to be for 2 reasons. First, we don't play Skyclave Apparition, which means that either creature matchups and things that are more permanent based are generally going to be a lot harder for Mono-Blue to deal with, because once the cards are resolved, they're resolved. And the second thing, of course, is that Mono-Blue actually plays counterspells in the main, where Bant generally does not. They of course do have Spell Queller, but that's not a true counterspell. Mono-Blue can deal with spells much better than Bant can, and for those reasons, we're going to see a very different matchup spread. First up, for example, let's talk about the Angels matchup. Angels absolutely bodies Mono-Blue Spirits. It's not close, it's not fun. And the reason for that is that just a single resolved Righteous Valkyrie, never mind a life gain, never mind a cool text of +2/+2, it's a 2/4 flyer. That alone is generally enough to hold down the fort against Mono-Blue Spirits. And a 2/4 flyer by itself, a lot of the time, really can block your creatures long enough for them to get their game plan established. And since their game plan is much bigger than your game plan is, you really can't give them that kind of time. But against Angels, you also generally don't have a choice. Blue-White Control is a pretty good matchup for Mono-Blue Spirits. It's not quite as good for Mono-Blue as it is for Bant, like we don't get the Selfless Spirits and stuff like that, but it is still pretty good. A Supreme Verdict, for example, can be evaded by using Slip Out the Back on a creature that you've already put a Curious Obsession on. And Curious Obsession itself can sometimes draw you 2, 3, maybe even 4 cards. And that by itself can help you outpace all of what Blue-White is doing, even if they get to resolve some cool cards like Teferi Hero of Dominaria or Behold the Multiverse. Sometimes you'll just get to draw even more cards than they do. Bant Spirits I would put right about B. So a lot of the times what happens is Bant Spirits will play creatures that are simply bigger than what you have the ability to provide. So Empyrean Eagle and Spell Queller, for example, are just naturally 2/3s, and that's bigger than every single card Mono-Blue plays. But you get to play more counterspells in cards like Mystical Dispute as a 4x out of your sideboard, where Bant Spirits typically only plays about 2. And that ends up working out pretty well for you if you can get under what Bant Spirits is trying to do. So it is totally possible to beat Bant as Mono-Blue, but it's gonna be a little bit of an uphill battle. Not uphill enough for me to put it into C tier, but something you should pay attention to nonetheless. Creativity is a very, very easy S tier matchup for Mono-Blue Spirits. And the namesake card Creativity is at least a 4-mana sorcery. That alone is going to be an extremely difficult task to help perform against Mono-Blue. And for that reason, we generally find this matchup pretty easy. Usually if you sit down and your opponent is playing Theme Vents and Valakut Awakening, you're having a pretty good time. Elves. This is not a matchup that you want to see. So Elves is just not really great for Spirits as a whole. And like like Bant, Mono-Blue also has a pretty hard time dealing with just how fast a lot of the stuff is from Elves. So Bant has a hard time because they're not actually countering any of what the Elves deck is doing, but they have the upside of having cards like Skyclave Apparition to help get rid of their onboard threats. Mono-Blue has almost exactly the opposite problem. We can't really deal with their onboard threats, but we can deal with things like Collected Company. The only problem with that is that when trying to deal with spells that Elves are casting, a lot of our counter spells are conditional. Spell Pierce, okay fine, Elves can pay 2. That's generally pretty easy. Lofty Denial, same thing, they can sometimes pay 4 pretty easily. And even Geistlight Snare, it costs 1 and is super sweet, but Elves can just pay 3 additional mana sometimes. And it's going to be relatively difficult for you to actually get around that. You can do so though, it's not impossible. Like, Mono-Blue Spirits will play cards like Aether Gust a lot of the times out of the sideboard, and of course Aether Gust will beat the entire Elves deck. Any card is instantly dealt with, whether it's on board or on the stack. And if you can leverage those kind of advantages long enough, you can certainly beat up on the Elves deck. But it's going to take some real work on your part. The Fires of Invention decks are going to be another S-tier matchup for Mono-Blue Spirits. So Mono-Blue has a great time against decks that are simply trying to resolve one big spell in a stack. And Fires of Invention being 4 mana totally counts as a big spell. That is exactly where we thrive. Trying to resolve a Fires of Invention against a Spell Pierce deck is an absolute nightmare. And we're already clocking you while we're doing all of it too. Since Karuga Fire specifically also can't play cards that cost less than 3, that means that all of their best removal is generally going to cost 2, but all of our solutions to their removal generally cost 2 or less. So if you're trying to play things like Colossal Sky Turtle to use the bounce effect, Touch the Spirit Realm to use the blink effect, or even Bonecrusher Giant for Stomp, well, Mono-Blue doesn't exactly have a tough time against any of those things. So their defensive plan doesn't really work against us, and our offensive plan doesn't really work against us. So what does Fires do? And the answer is usually lose. So Greasefang is going to be an A-tier matchup for Mono-Blue Spirits, and this is going to be for a few reasons. First, it's easier for us than it is for Bant, straight up, because we can actually counter the Greasefang, stopping it from ever hitting the table in the first place. But Bant Spirits generally has to do something about it post-resolving, like Shacklegeist to make sure it can't crew a vehicle, or Skyclave Apparition to get it off the table after it's already resolved. But Mono-Blue can generally do so before it even hits the table. One Lofty Denial, and now your plan sucks. But also, I specifically have been playing cards like Nebelgast Herald in my Mono-Blue list, where Bant generally doesn't have the kind of time for that, or deck space for that. But Nebelgast Herald is absolutely amazing against a deck like Greasefang, because they're generally trying to line up one big giant attacker, and if you can tap their big giant attacker, well, it's no longer an attacker. So I think this matchup is very, very good for Mono-Blue. It's pretty good for Bant too, though. So whichever version of Spirits you pick, you're going to have a really good time against the Rat. Gruul aggro is not a deck you want to see as Spirits. So when you're on the draw, it's generally a pretty difficult task to try to counterspell everything that your Gruul opponent is doing. And when you're on the play, a lot of the times it's still kind of difficult to get established with your game plan against a deck that's playing Bonecrusher Giant, Obliterating Bolt, and all the way up to Sky Sovereign. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem against Gruul is that they have all of those removal spells and cards like Llanowar Elf, so it's really hard for you to outpace them even when you're on the play. And that makes this deck a really tough matchup. It is winnable, especially if you have things like Aether Gust in your sideboard to help mitigate the matchup, but it's not going to be easy. And the Heroic deck, just like Bant, I think is going to live in the B tier. And this one is going to be like a low B, maybe even a C tier. I actually am going to put it into C tier. So a lot of the Heroic decks, especially when they're on the play, are just going to be able to body what you're doing with things like Reckless Rage and generally much bigger attackers than what you have the ability to provide. So if they have things like a Soulscar Mage or a Monastery Swiftspear, well, they're already going to be clocking you generally for a lot faster than you're clocking them. A Reckless Rage for 1 mana can basically delete any creature that you have, even with a Curious Obsession on it. And then post-board, they have the nerve to play cards like Rending Valley, making your life even more difficult. So you can get around the Heroic deck though. if you have your defensive cards lined up and can get something like a Shacklegeist or a Nebelgast Herald established, those creatures can and usually will make sure the heroic deck has 0 ability to attack. But getting those lined up without a removal spell sniping them is going to be a pretty tall order. So I think this is going to be a C tier matchup for us. Lotus Field is going to be one of those S tier matchups for us. We are extremely happy to see a spell-based matchup, and Lotus Field is the most powerful and probably best of the spell-based decks in Pioneer, period. This deck is really explosive though, so they can start doing their cool things as soon as turn 3, right? Like you get to copy a Lotus Field with Thespian Stage, use cards like Hidden Strings and pour over the pages to untap a lot of cool stuff. But even when they get all of that established, we still have enough counter spells in our deck to be able to make sure that their big payoff spells don't ever actually get to resolve. So if they're trying to resolve a pour over the pages, well, sometimes we have Spell Pierce and sometimes we just have an onboard Mausoleum Wanderer to help counter their spells. And Lotus Field trying to get over all of that stuff is gonna have a really hard time of doing it, especially since most of their key spells are blue. That's really, really good for the deck that's playing 4 Mystical Disputes in the sideboard. So Lotus Field just generally does not have a lot of fun against us. Mono Green Devotion is another S tier matchup for Mono Blue Spirits. This is a deck that we're very, very happy to see, even more so than Bant Spirits, because Bant Spirits a lot of the time, they do have things like Skyclave Apparition to get rid of the Old Growth Trolls and the Karns and a Mana Elf in a pinch, I guess. But Mono Blue Spirits effectively does the same thing because we have cards like Shacklegeist and Nebelgast Herald to tap down a Mana Elf if that's what we need to tap down, or a big attacker like a Old Growth Troll, maybe a big blocker like Cavalier of Thorns. And those are all things that Bant Spirits can play. But what they don't get to do is counterspell the really key cards. Bant has a pretty hard time countering anything like a Storm the Festival, for example, because that card simply costs more than 4, so Spell Queller will have no effect on a Storm the Festival. However, Mono Blue plays usually 8 to 10 cards in the main that can all deal with cards like Karn the Great Creator, Cavalier of Thorns, and Storm the Festival. So how does Mono Green really get to resolve those cards against Mono Blue? They usually don't. So we generally have a very easy time of that matchup, even post-board. Mono Red Aggro is going right into the D tier. This matchup is extremely difficult, especially when we lose the die roll. So since we can't remove cards from the battlefield on game 1, they will generally get established a lot faster than we can. They have cards like Swift Spear, Soulscar Mage, Kamano faces Kakazan, and even Eidolon and a Great Revelwinder on the play. And all of those cards present a very real threat to us. Post-board, we do have cards that can help stop what they're doing, right? Like we get to play copies of Aether Gust, some lists have cards like Aether Sphere Harvester, so there's a lot of real things that you can do about what the Mono Red deck is doing. But they're generally just getting rewarded for their base plan in game 1. And if you're unlucky enough to find the Mono Red player who's playing Goblin Chain Whirler, that thing can delete your entire board presence in 1 card resolving, while doing nothing to their stuff. It's difficult. You can win, but it's difficult. As before, mirror matches go right into the B tier, and Humans for Spirits is actually going to go right into the C tier. So, unlike Bant, we don't generally have the power and toughness in Mono Blue to compete with a lot of what the Humans deck is doing. But we do have cards like Nebelgast Herald, which allow you to tap cards in combat, which is honestly probably the only reason that Humans is not straight up going to the D tier. You can control combat, and a lot of their 1-drops are going to be 2-1s like Recruitment Officer, Kithian, and if you get to block these things profitably with a 1/3 Supreme Phantom, then you're generally going to have a pretty good time of it, right? Like you can gum up the blocking ground, they can't really attack through your thing, you can counterspell a key creature or 2, or even Rattle Chains in response to something like a Brutal Cathar or a sideboarded Skyclave Apparition. These are all things that you have the ability to do, but it's really hard when you're the one who lost the die roll. Sometimes they will just get under you and basically do whatever they want, and then they can set up a big Brave the Elements turn for unblockable stuff. Not really the most fun place to be, but if you are on the play, you can at least mitigate a lot of that by resolving cards like Shacklegeist in game 1 and then Nabelgast Herald later on, so that you're able to at least try to control combat until you're ready to start attacking. 5-color Niv is going to be an A tier matchup for Mono-Blue Spirits, and unlike Bant, we can actually do something about their much bigger spells in Mono-Blue. So a Bring to Light, for example, is going to be really hard to resolve against the Spell Pierce deck, but also Niv Mizzet Reborn, that's a 5 mana card. Good luck resolving that against Lofty Denial or Geistlight Snare, right? So we generally have a pretty good time against the 5-color Niv Mizzet decks, and even the removal, a lot of the times will just find itself losing to Slip Out the Back. And Slip Out the Back for 1 is a lot better than Selfless Spirit is on 2. Izzet Phoenix is going to go into C tier as far as matchups go for Mono Blue, and one of the biggest reasons for that is simply they draw more cards than we do. So a lot of the times we can get established, and we're trying to fight through all of the removal. We can eventually get a Curious Obsession resolved, and we can start attacking, and life is okay. But those games are kind of few and far between against the Izzet Phoenix deck. As Mono Blue, our primary job here is really just to keep cards like a Ledger Shredder off the board, because a Ledger Shredder being a 1/3 flyer is actually sufficient to block our entire board presence. So it's generally a lot of work to try to get Ledger Shredder off the stack. And the same goes for Thing in the Ice, just to a lesser extent. The Phoenixes themselves, being flyers, do present a threat as far as both attacking and blocking, but honestly, they're less annoying than Ledger Shredder is. Ledger Shredder by itself is the entire reason why we would rather dodge this matchup. Alright, so the Sacrifice deck is actually going to go into C tier for Mono Blue, whereas it was D tier for Bant. And the primary reason for that is because we can actually counter their spells like Mayhem Devil and Corvold, whereas Bant does not get to have that ability. And being able to keep these cards off the stack rather than off the table is so important for a deck that really cannot allow even one turn of Mayhem Devil doing its thing. If the Mayhem Devil resolves against Mono Blue, honestly the game is generally just over on the spot. But we have a lot more tools to prevent that from happening with our Lefty Denials, our Geistlight Snares, and in the sideboard we have cards like Aether Gust that can help that too. But if this card ever hits the table, you should probably just pack it up and keep it moving to the next game. And last but not least, we have Rakdos Midrange, the best deck in the format. This is a deck that I will actually put in the B tier, but I understand a lot of you will think of this as a C tier matchup. Rakdos is a deck that has a ton of creature removal, and for that reason, your job as a Spirits pilot is to know how to navigate your deck against that removal. If you do, you can totally win your games against Rakdos. It's not that bad. But you need to be patient while playing because they have, it feels like anyway, near infinite removal. Your edges against Rakdos generally come when you catch your opponent trying to resolve their threats and really, I guess, take their turn in the game. So if they're trying to resolve their big giant threats like Shieldred, Graveyard Trespasser, Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, all of these really big, busted, powerful spells, well, that's your opportunity to counter their spell, stop their plan, tell them their deck sucks, and then you can start establishing your thing. But if you try to press the issue really early with something like an Ascendant Spirit or a Mausoleum Wanderer, well, that's kind of how you get yourself blown out. A lot of people do find themselves getting blown out though, and that is why I believe a lot of people will think of the Rakdos matchup as being really difficult, because it is difficult, but it's also a lot more doable than you probably think. So, I don't know, watch some gameplay, learn how to navigate the Rakdos matchup, and I believe in you. Alright, and that's going to be our matchup analysis for both Bant and Mono Blue Spirits in Pioneer. So now that we've seen the difference between what the matchup spreads look like for the two versions of Spirits, you can now see why I don't really answer the question of which version of Spirits is better. Because they're not better or worse than the other, they're just different. But now that you can see the difference, I believe a lot of you can make the educated choice as to which version of Spirits is going to work out best for you. So that's what we're aiming to do today, and I hope this helped out. But that's going to be it for today's video. If you liked what you saw, as always, make sure to click the like button and let me know. subscribe to the channel if you're new, and I'll see y'all on the next one.